Hello, class, and welcome to the lecture on budget and performance. We're going to take a focused approach today for this lecture. The format for this lecture will focus on the best practices at the state and local levels for budgeting. I think it's important to review this information as many of you work at that level now or may do so after graduation. After reviewing those best practices for both local and state government, I'll provide a high-level overview of performance management to give you a sense of what that looks like and how you would incorporate that into your activities as a public official down the line. A local government's budget reflects three things: vision, strategy, and priorities. The process employed to develop that budget should be inclusive, transparent, and efficient. Involving elected leaders, department heads, and citizens in the budget development process creates buy-in amongst those groups, establishes trust, and simplifies the communication about the budget. Several key challenges face local governments as they begin to develop a budget. These challenges include limited government revenues, a lack of direction from elected leaders, a lack of a central vision for the local government, a lack of stakeholder buy-in, resulting in limited levels of citizen engagement, and a limited understanding and involvement in the budget process, a lack of budget ownership by departments, difficulty tracking budget revisions and performance measures, and staff turnover. You can see in this list how several of these concepts have been covered in this course thus far and come to bear on this very important process. Vision, stakeholder engagement, performance measures are all key aspects of developing any kind of budget, particularly at the local level. And while this lecture is focused on local and state budgeting and performance, you will note that these issues also apply to the federal level. It's really just a matter of magnitude. Based on insights from local government directors, there are several elements that comprise best practices that can be used to overcome these challenges. The first element is a clear and well-defined budget process. Having a clear, well-defined process means that there is a timeline that defines the budget development process, which includes month-to-month and annual steps that need to be taken to produce the budget. This process is one that should be accessible to all stakeholders in the process and defines the following: what occurs at each step of the timeline, when each step must occur, how long that step should take, and who should be involved in that particular step. The second element is to start with the vision, goals, and a strategic plan. There's a quote from Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, that is very applicable here. If you don't know where you are going, any road will get you there. It's critical for local government officials to know where you're going in order to properly plan for that journey, particularly when the expenditure of public funds is involved in that trip. This is a critical responsibility of the administrators and elected leaders of a community and can involve a variety of events, including a State of the City speech by the chief executive or mayor, a strategic planning and goal-setting session by the board or council, and engagement with key department heads on what the final plan looks like and their role in executing it, just to name a few. The third element is focus. And a year is a relatively short period of time for a community facing complex challenges. It's often best to prioritize one or two issues to focus on rather than dozens of priorities that dilute the city's ability to get anything done. This is also true at the federal level, where at CDC we often see the agency as a whole target 3 to 4 priorities for a 2 to 4 year period. Even where I sit at CDC, our division of about $170 million has prioritized one issue, hypertension, as its current focus, despite the fact that there are numerous other issues associated with heart disease and stroke prevention in the country. The fourth element is departmental buy-in. The bureaucracy on any governmental level is critical to achieving any goals or objectives set by government administrators and elected officials. The reality is, without their willingness to support the plan will not be executed properly. During budget development, department heads need to be actively engaged in the process so that they understand the vision, They understand where they and their department fits in that vision, and most importantly, they understand what their role is in that vision, meaning their department's role in executing that vision with real day-to-day activities. The fifth element is citizen input. Obtaining citizen input provides local governments with the ability to establish budgets that have broad-based support from the community and are more credible because of this support. There are many techniques for gaining this input: public hearings, town hall meetings, citizen academies, focus groups, and annual needs assessments or surveys. When engaging the public, city officials will be looking for 4 key pieces of information. What's most important to you? What should the local government's top priority be? What do you want to see more of from your local government? And most importantly, what are you willing to pay for? Getting answers to these questions and being able to link those answers to the budget priorities set by the local government are a powerful tool to build broad-based support. The one caveat to this is that this approach must be sincere and genuine. There will clearly be a need for priority setting, but if a local budget is developed without any linkages to community input, citizens will become distrustful of the process and unwilling to engage in the future. The final element is communications. It is absolutely critical that final budgets are effectively communicated to all stakeholders in clear and simple terms using a multitude of communication vehicles. This could include budget books, press releases, websites, executive summaries, and social media, just to name a few. You cannot over-communicate this information, and it ensures that the community as a whole, those who engaged in the process, and likely the majority of the community who did not engage in the process or understand the priorities, get a better sense of why choices were made in the local budget. The last element, communications, cannot be undersold. Failure to effectively communicate how local funds will be spent can undermine all the time and effort invested in the process. Local government officials need to commit to a communications plan that is transparent, simple, consistent, and repeatable. The communications should include compelling visuals that use data in a dynamic and, most importantly, understandable way. And there should be tools and mechanisms in place that allow for additional feedback and engagement after the budget is passed and while it is being implemented by government. So communications with the general public is not just a one-off. It is a continual process, and providing them insight into the budget, not only in development but during implementation, is critical. State budgets, like their local counterparts, are one of the most important documents produced by states. The process state to state can vary, with some states producing a single budget bill, an omnibus budget, while others replicate the federal approach by passing a series of individual bills covering specific elements of state government. The process can also be impacted by the length of time a legislative body is in session, with some bodies meeting year-round and others, like Georgia, meeting only a few months out of the year. State budgets can also be annual or biennium, 2-year budgets, and much like local budgets, are used as a blueprint for state activities during that budget period. State budgets can consist of one or more pools of money that comprise the operating budget. The majority of revenues are in the general fund, and this is used to finance day-to-day expenses and major programs. Most states also enact a separate capital fund designed to support long-term large capital projects like road building, land purchasing, the construction of buildings, etc. Generally speaking, when we reference the state budget, we're typically talking about the operating fund. The authority for the budget is typically split between the legislative and executive branches of state government. The executive branch typically has responsibilities for preparing agency budget requests, submitting budget recommendations to the legislature, approving and vetoing budget bills, and implementing the enacted budget. The legislative branch, on the other hand, has responsibility for deliberating budget requests, prioritizing spending and balancing the budget, enacting budget bills into law, authorizing spending and reviewing results, and overriding vetoes where appropriate. Now, in terms of budget drafting, the length of the budget varies from state to state, with some states drafting one-year budgets, other states drafting two-year budgets, and some states who draft two separate budget bills to cover a 2-year period of time. Another aspect that underpins state budgets is revenue forecasting. This process is designed to project state revenues for a length of time, typically 1 to 2 years, and this process serves as a benchmark for the size of the state budget in a given year. Responsibility for providing this forecast varies from state to state, with some states relying on the executive branch, others rely on a special board or commission, and still others rely on a consensus revenue forecast developed jointly by the executive and legislative branches. Finally, while there is a defined budget process in each state, there are times that process is delayed, much like the federal government. In those instances, states address this delay in a variety of ways. Some states use a continuing resolution process, like we do at the federal level, to maintain level funding from the prior year for a period of time until a new budget can be passed. Other states maintain funding for critical programs, and still others shut government down completely. The ideal is to get a budget passed on time, but sometimes that doesn't always happen, and so their approach to managing that process varies from state to state. There are several different approaches to budget development used at the state level. I'll provide an overview of 4 here today, and those 4 are traditional or incremental budgeting, performance-based budgeting, zero-based budgeting, and mixed budgeting. Now, traditional or incremental budgeting is an approach that examines each budget line and incrementally increases or decreases that line over time. This approach typically takes previous policies and/or programs for granted without a rigorous review of the expenditures against current priorities, effectiveness, or service outcomes. This line item focus puts priority on what the funds buy rather than the services or outcomes achieved. And while nothing in this approach prevents outcomes from being considered in the budget decisions, the nature of the process discourages that analysis. While this is a common approach to budgeting, and one that's really used at the federal level, it is criticized for failing to examine outcomes more carefully and serving as an obstacle to improved effective service delivery. The second type of budgeting is performance-based budgeting. This is a procedure that focuses on performance and results. The goal is to reward efficient and effective programs, encourage the revamping of programs that do not perform well, and in some cases eliminate ineffective programs altogether. This approach is designed to give lawmakers flexibility in adjusting the budget and reconsider priorities and funding decisions. This approach provides legislators with the ability to consider things like outcomes, cost-benefit analyses, savings potential, and return on investment when making future funding allocations. This approach has a couple practical challenges to implementation. It's often difficult to reach consensus on reasonable program goals and measures of success, and because of that, it's difficult to set those benchmarks in order to do the performance-based assessments that you need to. A second challenge is the level of control some programs have over their spending. In some cases, agencies are obligated to spend specified amounts per caseload or other factors and cannot exert much control over efficient spending. So if a particular agency must spend $5,000 per caseload and their caseload goes up by 50% in a given year, that's going to be a substantial increase in their spending, and there's not a lot of control that they have over that. The third approach to budgeting is zero-based budgeting. Here, states are able to review programs supported through a state budget from point zero, meaning that all programs start with $0, without giving priority to the continuation of the existing programs. This approach is designed to control expenditures by identifying the purpose of a program, measuring its effectiveness and efficiency in delivering its products or service. The challenge with this approach is that state programs are not well designed for an annual top-down review of this nature. A number of factors, including statutory requirements, obligations to local governments, and federal funding requirements, make this approach significantly challenging statewide. Finally, the fourth is mixed budgeting. And this is an approach whereby states incorporate elements of the techniques just discussed where appropriate to complement traditional line item approaches to budgeting. For example, in Georgia, performance measures were incorporated into the budget process, with agencies assigned to track the program performance over time. These performances are then reviewed by the Legislative Budget Office and the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget, and factored into proposed budgets for these programs, as well as the final allocation decisions. Georgia has also incorporated zero-based budgeting into their budget process by targeting certain programs from one year to the next that are required to submit annual budget requests in a zero-based budgeting format. This program targets programs in a mutual way. In other words, the governor and the legislature decide ahead of time which programs or agencies are going to be required to engage in zero-based budgeting. And then those programs or agencies have to submit a budget according to that format to both the governor and the legislature. Traditional budgeting and incremental approach continues to be the norm, despite some of the benefits described by the alternative approaches. The key reasons for this are the predictability and stability that comes with traditional budgeting, the time savings associated with traditional budgeting versus the time commitment associated with a more complex, analytically driven budget process, the inherent complexity of budgeting, the challenges associated with measuring different to competing needs and goals, and the flexibility this approach provides legislators on where to focus their oversight efforts from one year to the next. As one works to develop a state budget, it is critical to understand certain constraints that need to be factored into that process. These constraints include balanced budget requirements, which is a widespread constraint that essentially impacts all 50 states to one degree or another, and it must be considered during budget deliberations. This requirement forces states to budget within their financial means and eliminates their ability to deficit spend. But it can also result in severe reductions in services when revenues are tight or you experience shortfalls. The second is the tax and expenditure limitation. And these are legal caps on the growth of state expenditures and or revenues in order to control the growth of a state budget. These limitations adopted by individual states are seen as an effective way to control the size of state government. While opponents express concern that state governments may not be able to support critical public services sufficiently within such a cap. Finally, the last constraint that one needs to consider are voter initiatives in popular referendum. This exists in about 24 states, and it affords citizens the opportunity to pass or repeal laws, mandate or repeal spending programs, and impose controls over the legislature's tax and budget authority. And this, quite obviously, can put some serious limitations on the legislature's ability to manage revenues, spend dollars, that type of thing. So this is a situation where the voters can really exert quite a bit of control over the state budget process. These three common limitations are important to understand and plan for as state budgets are being developed. And if you're working in this area, you should definitely get a better sense of what the limitations are for your particular state. The management and balancing of state budgets can be a complicated task, as we've alluded to previously. State officials need to be adept at developing good revenue and expenditure forecasts and flexible enough to adjust if those forecasts prove wrong. There are 5 common ways to address the complications that come with budget development at the state level that are fairly simple and a whole lot of common sense. And you will likely see some commonalities in these approaches with the local level approach that we discussed earlier. First, there must be a general agreement on the basic budget numbers using established procedures in order to ensure a smooth process from the start. To facilitate this basic agreement, there needs to be either a statutory or constitutionally defined approach to produce a revenue forecast that is binding on both the executive and legislative branches. Setting this baseline creates a common place to start budget negotiations at the state level. And this is often why the federal budget process rarely works, because there's not a common starting point for budget negotiations. There's no statutory or constitutionally defined approach to producing revenue forecasts, and it makes it difficult for the executive and legislative branches to work together at the federal level. In fact, as someone who's worked on federal budgets almost his entire career, the real joke is that we spend 6 months developing budget proposals only for them to be dead on arrival when it reaches Congress. And that's the reality in probably 99.5% of the cases. So by establishing a mutually accepted process for creating a binding revenue forecast, you can remove some of the political gamemanship that occurs at the federal level. The process a state uses to get there, as described above, is not as critical as the existence of a process that all stakeholders accept and are willing to play by. Second, there should be an established and acceptable process for developing the forecasting statistics that drive the budget. Again, here we are looking for the best available data. This is not an opportunity to debate policy, for example. Whether the prison population is too high is not a subject that should be debated in a budget context. The prison population is the population. Whether it's too high or not is a policy debate for a different forum. If you've got a prison population at X, then you're responsible for providing for X. There should also be an agreed upon process for establishing the budget base. Stakeholders should agree on what is included in the base and what is not included in the base. The most common approach is to use the current operating budget as the baseline for discussing the future budget. What is included, capital expenditures, inflation adjustments, etc., is important, but what's more important is that there's an agreement on what should be included and excluded from the outset. So whether you include those other factors, capital expenditures, inflation adjustments, midterm corrections to the budget, is a good thing to discuss and reach an agreement on, but you need to have that process in place no matter what. Accounting for tax expenditures is critical to determining the bottom line as well. Tax expenditures are essentially tax breaks state government uses to encourage certain behaviors designated as public goods. These could include charitable donations or tax breaks for economic purposes, among a couple of examples. Whatever these tax expenditures are, they represent real dollars that have not been collected and must be accounted for in the revenue projections in order to ensure that the starting state projections for revenues are as accurate as possible. Ideally, these expenditures and their impact on the bottom line revenues for a given state should regularly be reviewed and updated to account for missed revenues and also permit elected officials to determine the costs and benefits of maintaining these breaks in the future, and whether some of these breaks should be eliminated in order to increase state revenues. In addition to have a process for operating budgets, states should also have a clear set of guidelines for capital budgeting. As I said before, capital budgets typically function outside the operating budget and represent major projects like road construction, land purchasing, or land development. While this budget on paper may exist outside the operating budget, it still reflects state expenditures, and there needs to be a process for how capital budgets are prioritized and how they are adjusted, specifically in times when state revenues decline. There should also be an established process for managing revenue shortfalls when they occur, and they will occur. This includes cutting budgets in a way that is well designed and makes the process a bit easier. Now, to be clear, cutting budgets is always going to be difficult and painful. And when revenues drop, these cuts are always going to result in winners and losers. But if you have a pre-designed plan in place and ready to address that issue, then that's going to make the process a bit easier and make stakeholders understand what's going to be expected of them moving forward in that kind of environment. Finally, always be wary of quick fixes and budgeting challenges. The laws of unintended consequences always seem to apply when a short-term budget fix is adopted without adequate consideration for long-term implications. So the shortcut is not always going to be the best approach long-term, and you need to keep that in mind when presented with quick fixes to a budget challenge that may create more problems down the line for you. Finally, the process reflected in this list of activities is not substantially different from the local level. You need to start the process as early as possible in both the legislative and executive branches. This is not a competitive process, but legislative hearings and the development of a governor's budget submission are not mutually dependent on each other. So get this work done early so that delays in passing and enacting a budget can be avoided. Identify who should be involved in the process, including stakeholders, and implement ways to engage them early and often. As with local governments, the more support you have amongst the public, the better your budget will be and the easier it will be to pass. Those in positions of leadership also need to exert leadership in an effective way. A budget can serve as an effective rudder to steer the state government towards priority goals, but the absence of leadership will eliminate that rudder, and the state government will have no clear direction in which to head. Finally, as described with local government budgeting, communicate. Do whatever you can to maximize communications with the general public about the development of the budget. The processes at the state level can be at the local level can be mirrored at the state level and then some. So utilize all these resources and communication vehicles to your advantage. Take advantage of every opportunity to communicate this information to the general public and build a case for why you think this budgetary process is appropriate for a given year. Finally, I want to touch briefly on performance management. Throughout this lecture, performance has been implicated as a critical piece of the budgetary process. Measuring and reporting out program performance is an essential tool for documenting program success and justifying future budget allocations moving forward. By investing in performance management, local and state governments can ensure that government is accountable to the citizens and that the efforts of government are focused on a number of key critical aspects. And these include understanding public needs, identifying and implementing programs and services that will meet those needs, assuring that policies, strategies, and services are in alignment, collecting and analyzing performance information, applying information to continuously improve results and become more efficient, using data more effectively to inform policy decisions, supporting accountability both within the organization and to the public, providing understandable information on performance to the public, and encouraging citizens to provide feedback and get involved in the government's decision-making processes. For our purposes, performance management is an ongoing, systematic approach to improving results through evidence-based decision-making, continuous organizational learning, and a focus on accountability for performance. Performance management should be integrated into all aspects of an organization's management and policy-making process, transforming an organization's practices so it is focused on achieving improved results for the public. Performance management comprises the concerted effort an organization takes to apply objective information to management and policymaking in order to improve results. Performance management uses evidence for measurement to support government planning, funding, and operations. Better information enables elected officials and managers to recognize success, identify problem areas, and respond with appropriate actions. Also to learn from experience and apply that knowledge to better serve the public. Performance measurement and performance management are often used interchangeably. However, they are distinctly different. For decades, some governmental entities have measured outputs and inputs, and less commonly efficiency and effectiveness. Performance measurement helps government monitor performance. Many governments have tracked and reported key statistics at regular intervals and communicated them to stakeholders. Although measurement is a critical component of performance management, measuring and reporting have rarely led in organizational learning and improved outcomes. Performance management, on the other hand, encompasses an array of practices that are designed to improve performance. Performance management systematically uses measurement and data analysis, as well as other tools, to facilitate learning and improve and strengthen the focus on results. The emphasis towards incorporating performance management into the governing structure is driven by 4 elements. First, an understanding that rationality is the underlying force of performance management, and that public managers at all levels are able to make better decisions when the process is informed by relevant data. Second, a realization that a process approach to accountability is not sufficient. Officials, managers, and employees at all levels must be accountable, not just for following processes, but for producing results that address public needs. Third, that performance management is not only a professional expectation for public officials and employees, but also an ethical expectation. And finally, while politics will always be an important force in the governmental environment, there must also be a place for accurate, timely, and unbiased information for high-level decision-making, as well as for day-to-day management. Now, there are any number of ways to build out a performance management structure in public sector agencies. However, whatever process is chosen, the approach should be grounded in 7 basic performance management principles. And those principles are a results-focused that permeates strategies, processes, the organizational culture, and decision-making. Information, measures, goals, priorities, and activities that are relevant to the priorities and well-being of the government and the community. Information related to performance, decisions, regulations, and processes that are transparent, easy to access, easy to use, and easy to understand. Goals, programs, activities, and resources that are aligned with priorities and desired results. Decisions and processes that are driven by timely, accurate, and meaningful data. Practices that are sustainable over time and across organizational changes. And performance management, a performance management process that transforms the organization, its management, and the policy-making process. If a performance management system is properly developed, resourced, and maintained over time, organizations will be more transparent to their constituencies, more deliberative and rational about their budgeting and policy decisions, and ultimately more accountable for the public funds they are entrusted with spending. The concepts of budgeting and performance management are intricately linked, and it is rare that one occurs without the other. One of the tasks in my office is to generate state profiles that reflect the status of cardiovascular health in each state, how much my division invests in that state, and what the specific state investments have generated in terms of results. The challenge for us is to obtain health improvement data to incorporate into these materials as a way to show return on investment for our expenditures. The development of this information is not always easy. Sometimes the data is tough to come by, but recent improvements in the development of this information have generated budget increases for my division of about $15 to $20 million over the last 5 years. And ultimately, this is a true testament of the symbiotic relationship between performance management and budgeting. As always, thank you for your attention, and please let me know if you have any questions.